Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to do something a little different. I am comparing 3 copies of River Raid, and all 3 are different. Here is the first one, released in '82 by Activision for the Atari 2600. This is the version I grew up playing and know and love well. Let's pop it in for a quick overview. Now in River Raid you control that yellow airplane. It's a fighter jet, I believe. And your goal is to traverse the river and blow up everything you see that moves. There are 3 enemies in this version. They are battleships, helicopters, and airplanes. You have to refuel sporadically throughout the game. If you run out of fuel, you'll actually crash. Your fuel gauge is at the bottom of the screen, along with your points and the number of lives you have left. Currently I have 3 lives. Every so often in River Raid you'll come across bridges. Simply shoot the bridges to blow them up, and that's a crude form of continuation. It's a checkpoint, if you will. So when you do die, you will be restarted from the last bridge you blew up. And that's about the gist of it. The game is simple in concept, but quite fun to play. I used to play this game for hours as a kid, and I could still find myself playing it for hours if I'm in a River Raid type of mood. It really is a great game. It's a classic. It's one of the best games actually ever released for the Atari 2600. It's also one of the first games I can recall that used distance as a mark of skill. How good you were at River Raid depended on how far you could get. And that was a precursor to actually finishing a game by completing it, instead of just scoring high points. Next up we have River Raid for the Intellivision. This came out roughly a year later, in 1983. You can see some nice label art there. Let's pop it in the old Intellivision and see what we see, shall we? Okay, right off the bat you can see a lot of things that are different, even though the general gameplay and concept is still the same. The river is much less angular, it looks more natural, more river-like if you will. And there are the same enemies in this game as there were in the Atari game. The fuel containers are turned on their side and given a 3D drum type look. Now, while that may seem like just an aesthetic change right there, it actually changes gameplay quite significantly, because now the fuel containers are a much easier target to hit, so it's much easier to accidentally blow up a fuel container, and you have less time to refuel as you pass over them. Now, aside from the graphics having a major overhaul, the player information and data is oriented to the right of the screen instead of the bottom. So that's where your fuel gauge is, your points, and your number of lives. And your fuel gauge is more of a meter in this. It was a meter in the other one, but it's less detailed than the Atari 2600, shall we say. One of the nice touches, I think, in this version is the attention to detail on things like the helicopters and bridges. But for some unknown reason, they removed houses from the background. I can't figure out why. It kind of made the Atari scenery nice. But in this version, it's just all trees. And the graphics weren't the only thing to get an overhaul. The sound effects in this version have been upgraded, and generally sound quite nice. The explosions make quite a pleasing sound. Now, while the Atari 2600 version of River Raid is fantastic, I think the Intellivision version is that much better than the Atari version. It's just a great, generally fun game to play, pleasing to look at, and an overall good time. And a really cool feature in this version of the game is that when you die and lose all your lives, at the very end, you'll have a points tally, and it'll also tally up the number of bridges that you've destroyed to help you keep track of how far you've actually gotten in the game. And that's an awesome feature. And there you have it, River Raid for the Intellivision. Now let's move on to console number 3 and River Raid number 3 for the Colecovision. This is one of the more interesting versions of this game, I must say. I was very surprised at the little features in this one. Let's pop it in. So we fast forward 1 year to 1984 with the Colecovision version of River Raid. And at first glance, it looks more or less like they got back to basics with the Atari 2600 version. The fuel tanks are in their proper orientation, and generally it looks like just a well-improved graphics. What the f*** is that? Okay, I guess they decided to throw some tanks in the mix. Alright. So I was going to say it's, you know, just more or less improved graphics than the Atari 2600. But I can't say that because they threw in tanks. And as you can see, now they also threw in balloons. So there are now tanks and hot air balloons, 2 additional enemies from the Intellivision and Atari 2600 version. Bravo Activision for giving people their money's worth if they decided to buy the Colecovision version 2 years after the original came out. At least you were getting something a little bit fresh and new. Now, I had never played the Colecovision version of River Raid until now. You're seeing the first time I've ever played it. And I gotta say, I was quite impressed. It has now become my favorite Colecovision game. What made River Raid so great for the Atari 2600 was the control. You felt like you had ultimate control, and you could really get a sense of mastering the game as you played. You felt one with the controller when you played. That kind of didn't feel so hot with the Intellivision version. The controller wasn't really that well suited to this type of game, but it worked, and it worked fairly good, considering. But when you play this game with the Colecovision controller, it's almost like it was built for the game. The Colecovision controller really starts to shine as you advance in River Raid. Now, I do realize that most people, if they're familiar with River Raid, they're only really familiar with the Atari 2600 version. But I must say, if you have an Intellivision or you have a Colecovision, you must pick these up. They're just great games. All 3 versions bring something new to the table. They're all fun and challenging. And incidentally, this game was designed by Carol Shaw, one of the first female game designers ever. Pretty interesting little footnote. Now, you can pick up River Raid for the Atari 2600 fairly easily. It's a very common game. You can pick it up for like $1 if you look hard enough. There's so many copies of it out there. When you start looking for it on the Intellivision or Colecovision, you might be a little more hard-pressed to find copies, because it was basically getting into the beginning of the video game crash. But they are out there, and you can pick them up for not that much money. I'm Dommy from Classic Games Revisited. Until next time.